Hello, people. I'm Jaby KOAY, joined by Andrew Flash Gordon.
What's up?
And we're looking at how Russia-China's economic strategy is crushing the dollar. Currency Wars Case Study, Episode 2. This is from Think School's, the YouTube channel. I know that you really like Think School's videos, and so that's why we're looking at this one. It seemed to do fairly well. It's got 2.1 million views, so I thought, okay, well, the Indian audience is interested in this, so I thought we could take a look at this ourselves and maybe provide some commentary, perhaps, possibly, hopefully, something interesting. So, if you guys haven't already, hit that subscribe button, bell icon, all notifications, and pretty please vote this up. Let YouTube know you're enjoying what you're watching. While you're subscribing and upvoting, subscribe to Think School. There's a link in the description below. If you want to click on that link, give the original video an upvote, and subscribe to them from there. Here we go.
For decades, world trade has been dominated by the dollar.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
The SWIFT system, that actually became weaponized by the U.S.
The Monetary Authority of Singapore and the People's Bank of China have renewed the bilateral currency swap arrangement.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
But as ties with Washington continue to be strained, Beijing and Moscow are diversifying.
China and Russia had taken another step closer towards dumping the dollar and agreed to trade in their respective national currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan.
Hi everybody, the US dollar has been the most powerful currency in the world for 80 long years, and like we saw in the previous episodes, this reserve currency status gives the United States such unprecedented power over the world economy that it can cripple the economy of any country within a fortnight. And because of this power, it has even dominated giant players like Russia and China. But you know what, guys? This is where China and Russia have actually come up with a master plan to kill the dollar dominance in the world. And if you look at the past 10 years data, you will see that it's actually working out quite well. In 1999, USD had 71% market share among the global reserve currencies. But in the past 10 years, it has dropped to less than 59%.
Wow.
And in the next 10 years, if this strategy of China and Russia works out, we might see the rise of a new reserve currency in the form of Chinese yuan. So the question is, what is this master plan of China and Russia to kill the dollar dominance in the world? How do they plan to dethrone US from the superpower status of the world? And lastly, what are the challenges that China and Russia will face in this currency wars of the world?
I don't know what Russia's doing exactly, but I know that a lot of Chinese people have come to the States and bought up a lot of real estate.
Yes.
They don't just buy it like through the regular channels. They come in with like a case of cash. They just buy it outright. Cash.
Yeah.
Cash in hand. It's crazy and scary, like how much that's going on. And I didn't read this, I heard that when our economy went into the toilet in 2020, Chinese were buying up a lot of shares of our stocks. I don't know how that works. It's kind of infuriating because, like there's the Wuhan virus and then Chinese are buying up stocks. It just looks like, from a conspiracy theory standpoint, it looks like a move that was deliberate, like we're going to do this, cripple the economy, then we're going to go and buy all this shit up. Sounds preposterous, and then you look at what they were doing in Africa and you're like, maybe it's not preposterous.
To understand this China-Russia strategy, we first have to understand why is the US dollar so powerful and why does it have almost a monopoly status among the reserve currencies of the world. And if you watched our dollar superpower episode and if you remember this concept, please skip to this timestamp. If you don't, here's a quick and short explanation of the same. Firstly, dollar served as a reserve currency of trust, whereby in 1994, US said if you have dollars, we would exchange its value in gold at $35 per ounce. So now, two countries that may or may not trust each other could do trade with each other without trouble. So this way, when Indonesia got $1 million from Pakistan, even if Indonesia did not trust Pakistan, they know for sure that the $1 million that they got could be exchanged for gold with the US. So it was definitely worthy. Otherwise, if they do trade with Pakistan in Pakistani rupees, today 10,000 Pakistani rupees might be worthy of buying 1 gram of gold. But the next week itself, if Pakistan prints more money and declares that 20,000 Pakistani rupee will buy you 1 gram of gold, do you realize what would happen? The entire value of trade with Indonesia would actually collapse. Moreover, if Indonesia wants to use Pakistani rupees, then if other countries do not trust Pakistan's economy, then that money again could not be used for trade. But if the same transaction happened in dollars, the United States guaranteed the value of dollars with gold. So you could trade with any country with the US dollars and be rest assured that it could be used to trade with any other country to buy any other commodity. But, in 1971, Richard Nixon came out of nowhere and ended this gold standard where everyone was free to choose any currency to trade.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. and the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
But even then, almost all countries stuck to the dollar. Why? Because dollar was the only currency that could buy you oil from the Saudis. And why is that? Because in 1945, the US President Franklin Roosevelt made an agreement of the century with the Saudi king, whereby the US guaranteed the security of Saudi Arabia, and in exchange, the Saudi king agreed to sell oil in US dollars. So if you wanted to buy oil, you needed to have US dollars. This is the second reason for the dominance of the dollar, and that is the power to purchase oil.
Did you know about this?
No idea.
I didn't learn about that in school. This is not something that was taught to us in history class, and it feels like it really, really should have been. I didn't really even understand why we got off the gold standard. It seemed like a bad move, because now money is just like, it's just paper. It's just an idea. Like, that idea actually had a physical basis. Now it's just something we agree on.
Yeah, and the fact that you can just print it at will, it kind of loses its value right there,
Well,
too.
it literally does.
Yeah.
Kind of, it literally does.
Yeah.
And these two superpowers of trust and oil gave the US the third superpower through the SWIFT network. And how does the SWIFT network work? Through the US dollars stored in US bank accounts. So if an Indian trader wanted to make a transaction to the Sri Lankan trader, this system would have an Indian trader, an Indian bank, an American bank 1, American bank 2, foreign bank and foreign trader. The highlight over here being both Indian and Sri Lankan banks will have an account in the American bank where it has its money stored in dollars. So if Reliance wants to import minerals worth 1 crore rupees from Sri Lanka, they would give the Indian bank 1 crore Indian rupees and ask them to pay the same amount in dollars to the Sri Lankan trader's account. So now that Indian bank has 1 crore rupees in its Indian account, it would send a message to its dollar account in America to send 1 crore worth of dollars to the Sri Lankan bank's dollar account in the US. In this case, assuming 80 rupees to the dollar to be exchange rate, $125,000 would be transferred from the Indian account in the US to the Sri Lankan account in the US. And now that the Sri Lankan bank has $125,000 in the US account, it would pay the Sri Lankan trader the equivalent of $125,000 from its account in Sri Lanka. This is how the SWIFT network works, and just like Indian and Sri Lankan banks, today more than 200 countries and 10,000 banks trade with the US dollars and have their forex reserves with the American banks. And the catch over here is that if a country has $100 billion in forex and spends only $30 billion in import and export, they would have $70 billion in surplus, right?
Right.
So you know what? Just like we avoid keeping a lot of savings and invest our money in stocks, these countries invest their excess foreign reserves in US Treasury bonds.
You know, the question that's begging in my mind, and I hope he gets into it a little bit, what is the effect of the neutral currency being the US dollar? And what will the effect be if the Chinese, what is it, the Yuan? I forgot what they called it. If that becomes the standard, what happens next? How can they leverage it is my question, I suppose. Like, is it more scary because they can just like push you out at will if they don't like what you're doing? Kind of like how when we try to get a movie over there, if there's not enough Chinese propaganda, I think it's like 30 American movies are allowed into China each year or something really small. And if there isn't enough Chinese propaganda in a film featuring Asians or something like that, they won't let it in. And so if they don't like what you're doing, the people aren't going to see it. They're not going to be exposed to it. I think that Shang-Chi wasn't allowed into China.
Really?
Mulan was not allowed into China. With that kind of ideology in place, dictating things, it does scare me. Like if the yuan or the won becomes the main currency, like what then will happen? Like how will that affect trade? I feel like that can't sustain itself because at a certain point, if China keeps going, oh, you can't, no to this, no to this, no to this, whereas the US dollar, as far as I know, has been more like, yeah, do what you want to do. I feel like that's going to have a negative impact on China's control. Over time, people are just going to get sick of it and go back to the US dollar. Or it's just going to be crypto.
And just like our government bonds, this is a mega bond whereby countries are lending billions of excess dollars to the US and expect a return after maturity. And this is where the unfair advantage of the US dollar comes in. As of January 2022, while Japan had $1.3 trillion in US securities, China holds $1.06 trillion and UK held $608 billion in US Treasury bonds. And in total, the US held $7 trillion by foreign and international investors as of September 2021. This is so much money that it's more than the GDP of France, India and Russia combined. So in simple words, the US dollar has three superpowers: trust for trade, power to buy oil, and lastly, it has all the excess forex reserves invested in its own economy with $7 trillion in bonds. By the way guys, these excess dollars are called as Petro-dollars. And this is where both Russia and China have a problem. And like we saw in the previous episodes, China is extremely annoyed at the US for supporting Taiwan, and Russia is already the most sanctioned country in the world. So now, Russia is not able to use its dollar accounts in the US to do trade, and at the same time, most of the Russian companies have also been removed from the SWIFT network. So with two superpowers being bullied by one big Uncle Sam, both of them got pissed and joined hands to take down the mighty United States of America itself. And this is where China and Russia started their game plan. So the question is, how can China and Russia together kill the dominance of the dollar, and what exactly is their strategy?
This is crazy to me because I'm like, you have to get other countries on board. It can't just be China and Russia, right? With what Russia is doing in Ukraine, what China's doing to Hong Kong and Taiwan, I can't imagine that a lot of countries necessarily want to associate with China and Russia and make deals with China and Russia. Maybe they got really convincing people on the ground who were like, no, this is what you got to do. This is the future, baby. Get away from America's dollar.
If China and Russia control everything, I mean, then what choice do they have, right?
Well, they don't control everything yet.
Well, the first thing we need to understand is that leverage is one of the most powerful tools in geopolitics. In this case, Russia is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. So although Saudi and other countries were selling oil and gas in dollars, Russia punished its unfriendly countries by asking them to buy Russian oil in rubles. So by default, most of the European countries had to buy ruble in spite of they hating Putin for it. Which means what? In the payment network diagram, instead of US bank having dollar reserves, all the unfriendly countries that bought oil from Russia now had to keep their money in Russian central bank. So just like dollar reserves helped the US economy, the ruble reserves are expected to compromise for the damage to the Russian economy. Which means, just like petro-dollar, we are seeing the rise of petro-ruble. And if you look at Russia's dollar reserves, they have been preparing to get rid of the dollar since 2014 itself. And if you see this graph, the US treasuries have gone down from $150 billion in 2013 to just $3.98 billion as of 2021. This is the leverage that Russia has over Europe. Similarly, China has its leverage with the Belt and Road Initiative countries. And if you remember from our BRI episode, China's Belt and Road Initiative is a $3 trillion project whereby the Chinese have given out over-generous loans to countries all across the world.
Yeah.
And you know what? Under the BRI initiative, in total, there are 165 countries in the world who owe a collective debt of $385 billion to China. And many of these countries have taken so much debt from China that they cannot afford to pay it back to China.
Wow.
And we saw this very, very clearly with both Pakistan and Sri Lanka, right? And this is where China's strategic move comes in. And now that China has a leverage over these countries, experts say that China would now ask these countries to take and pay back loans in Yuan. And in exchange, China could incentivize the scheme by giving them a 1% discount on their interest. Now, do you realize if Pakistan owes $24.7 billion in debt to China, considering its economic crisis right now, a 1% discount on a $24.7 billion in debt is a big deal for Pakistan. In fact, since the inception of the BRI initiative, China has already issued 14% of all its loans in its own currency without depending on the dollar.
This is so scary, dude. Wow. I asked the question, he freaking answered it. This is really scary. I didn't even think about that. You know that China's been loaning out money like crazy, right?
Yeah.
The ability to call it in, but say, oh, well, you have to deal in this currency in order to repay it, and we'll give you a discount on your debt. We'll give you a forgiveness of 1%. That's crazy. They literally don't have a choice. I mean, the country's going to go bankrupt otherwise.
And guess what? In 2018, the Central Bank of Pakistan had already agreed to conduct their bilateral trade with China in Yuan. And even other countries like Myanmar, Cambodia and Russia are doing the same now. On top of that, China is now the largest trade partner with 25 BRI participating countries. So again, the leverage of trade for China is very strong. So you see, with the combination of both trade and debt, China could pressurize these countries to use Yuan over the dollar. So this way, over time, China could pull the strings of 165 nations and could drastically increase the circulation of Yuan. Now the question over here is, all these countries are mostly poor countries, right?
Yeah.
So how would China and Russia get rich countries like England and South Korea to skip the dollar? Well, firstly, Russia is strongly supporting China and has already turned the Chinese yuan into their reserve currency. So this is a major move. And as far as other countries are concerned, they have something called bilateral currency swap agreement. And this is something that even India is pursuing very, very strategically with its ally countries. So the question is, what is the bilateral currency swap agreement and how does it actually work in international trade? As usual, let's try to understand this using a story. Let's say China and UK sign a bilateral currency swap agreement of 5 years for a value of $1 million. What this means is that China will sell $1 million worth of yuan to UK and UK will sell $1 million worth of pounds to China. So after conversion, China will give 6.842 million yuan to UK and UK will give China 847,250 pounds. And they will agree upon the exchange rate to be 8.07. So for 5 years, Chinese central bank can sell these pounds and get US dollars, or it can lend these pounds to domestic bank and companies to settle their trade. Similarly, the Bank of England can do the same with yuan. So now, if an English businessman wants to buy 1 million yuan worth of goods from China, if he went by the conventional means, what would he have to do? He would have to pay in pounds to the English bank, which will then convert the sum to dollars, then transfer the dollars to the US bank account of China, and then the Chinese bank will transfer the converted sum of yuan to the Chinese businessman. This will incur both a lot of time and a lot of cost.
Right.
But now, the English businessman would simply borrow 1 million yuan from the Bank of England and directly pay the Chinese bank account in England. And as soon as this money is transferred in the Chinese bank account in England, the Chinese bank in China would transfer 1 million yuan to the Chinese businessman. And the same thing could be done vice versa when a Chinese businessman wants to buy something from UK. So if you see, two big players can now do international trade without depending on the US dollar. This is how the currency swap agreement works. And after 5 years, both the central banks of UK and China will pay their respective currencies back at the agreed exchange rate of 8.07. So this way, both countries get three major advantages. Number one, both countries can eliminate their exchange risk. Number two, both countries can use this currency to exchange it for dollars if needed. And thirdly, businesses in both countries can carry out trade more economically.
Wow.
So the business relationship between both the countries gets better and better with time. And last and most importantly, the dependency on US dollar decreases by a large extent.
Yeah.
And guess what? Beijing has signed more than 3 trillion yuan worth of bilateral currency swap deals with more than 40 countries across the world.
Wow.
And this includes 400 billion yuan each with Hong Kong and South Korea, 350 billion yuan each with Bank of England and the European Central Bank, 300 billion yuan with Singapore and 150 billion yuan with Russia. And cherry on the cake, since China is the world's largest manufacturer with almost 20% of the entire world's manufacturing happening in China, they could further leverage this in order to push the companies to pay in yuan instead of the US dollars.
Jesus Christ.
And guess what? Now, Saudi Arabia is considering selling oil in yuan, which means if Saudi Arabia starts selling oil in yuan, a lot of countries would rush to buy yuan. Whoa. And again, like we saw in the case with excess forex being invested in US bonds, the excess yuan would then be invested in Chinese bonds, making the Chinese economy more and more powerful. This is how China and Russia are slowly building their currency strategies to overthrow the reserve currency throne from the US dollar. So this strategy looks pretty clean and straightforward, right? Now, does this mean that yuan is going to overthrow the dollar? Well, not really. And this brings me to the last part of the episode, and that are the challenges that yuan is going to face in this currency war against the dollar.
This is super frightening. I mean, I know he's going to give us like the other end of it now, going, no need to be afraid. It'll be okay. They've been saying for years that America's not going to stay number one. That hasn't really meant a whole lot to me, that idea. America's number one. I don't study politics. It's not really something I dive into, so it hasn't really meant a heck of a lot to me. But watching these kinds of videos helps to expand my horizons to understand the context of that statement and why, you know, America has been number one, where it's number one, and how it will fall into a lower position. Like, what does that mean to the average person who lives here, right? Because we are the biggest consumers per capita, as I understand it. American consumers consume more than anybody else in the world. How will that change? You know, what will the shifts look like to your average person, just like out and about shopping?
That was kind of my whole thing with, I mean, this is a scary notion, but then like if the yuan becomes the dominant power in terms of the dollar not being the dominant power, like how would that change for the average person? Like that's what I'm very curious. I mean, I don't know if I want to get to that place, but if it does, like what does that mean for us here at home? So, I mean, it is a curious and scary notion at the same time.
It gives them more leverage, and I don't know what that means. Like, if the U.S. does something that China doesn't like, then China can then place sanctions on us, I guess, the way that we have placed sanctions on Russia. The thing is, so much of what we get is from China. What makes it convenient to shop on Amazon and we get something within an hour or within the day or the next day, that level of convenience comes because of China and, importing from China. The iPhone, would cost at least a little bit more if it was made here instead of in China. And now I know a lot of the factories and stuff are being shifted over to India, or at least they are building factories in India, or they have factories in India making iPhones now. But still, like, for a long time, our iPhones were coming straight from China. I can't even imagine what that might look like and how that might stifle trade, us getting certain goods that we're used to getting very conveniently. Things would just become inconvenient is what I imagine it will look like. Just like the gas prices going up. You might not get the things you're after. There might be higher scarcity of things that we're used to getting like that, like baby wipes.
Moving on, the first challenge that both China and Russia are going to face is their notorious reputation in the world. China has a reputation of being notorious with the debt trap diplomacy and Taiwan invasion, and Russia is already being cornered by the West. Secondly, China has been devaluing its currency very, very frequently. In fact, the US has even accused China for currency manipulation. On top of that, by now it is pretty clear to the world that China is not as transparent as the US. So it's going to deter the countries from actually adopting the yuan over the US dollars.
That's what I was saying.
And lastly, US obviously does not like the rise of yuan, and the amount of money and military leverage that US has, it's not so difficult for them to actually push against the Chinese yuan. And the key to this is going to be something called the digital dollar and its war against digital yuan. I'll be making a separate video on this, but for now, this is information overload, so have a look at the study materials and do let me know what you think.
This is very informative. This might be my favorite video of his yet. I guess because it has a direct impact on my experience. I know this is your first video as his, but I think the other videos I've seen from him generally deal more focused on the Indian economy. This is more global.
I mean, I knew China and Russia were working together to devalue the dollar and, have the yuan take over. The detail he went into and what he was saying, it's interesting as well as scary, just because of what it could cause, for us here at home, and just the notion of strategies that they're trying to uphold to devalue the dollar. It's crazy. And then the pie chart that he showed us too, with how much the dollar has devalued from 1999 all the way to now. It's insane to see. It's like I knew it's been devalued since then, but I just didn't realize it had been that low. So I mean, definitely. Like you pointed out, he opened up my horizons too, because there were definitely some things here I had never known. How one bank gets it, then it goes to another bank, gets transferred to another bank, gets transferred to another. I mean, there was definitely a lot of things in here that I wasn't really up to date on, because I don't usually study this type of stuff. I'm not really up to date on my economics history, but this guy's very informative. He's really good.
Just to illustrate the difference in economy, my mom bought her house in North Hollywood in 1994 for $136,000. Today, that property is they don't have it anymore. My dad obviously passed away, but that same property is worth somewhere in the vicinity of $600,000 to $750,000 now. That's a huge jump in the last 25 years or so. But anyway, guys, thanks so much for hanging out. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Do subscribe, hit that bell icon, please, all notifications, and vote this up. I'm Jaby KOAY. This is
Andrew Flash Gordon.
Peace out.